June 22, 1941. Berlin, Germany. As 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory in the largest invasion force ever assembled, Adolf Hitler made a prediction to his generals that would define the next 6 months of catastrophe. His exact words varied in different accounts, but the message was always the same. Destroying the Soviet Union would be simple, quick, inevitable. We have only to kick in the door, Hitler declared with absolute confidence, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. Kick in the door. 4 words that transformed military strategy into metaphor, replaced logistics with wishful thinking, and sent millions of men into battle without winter coats, because their leader believed the war would be over before snow fell. Hitler had not received intelligence reports about Soviet industrial capacity. He had dismissed warnings from generals who studied Russian geography. The implications of fighting across 1,000 miles of hostile territory in sub-zero temperatures remained unexamined. Yet Hitler spoke with absolute certainty, not strategy, not caution, certainty. The Soviet Union was rotten, he proclaimed. One kick would collapse it. What he said in those crucial months before and after Operation Barbarossa would reveal not military genius or tactical brilliance, but something far more dangerous: unshakable faith in ideological superiority, while ignoring every mathematical reality that would doom his army. Before we dive into this story, subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now, relax, grab your coffee, and enjoy this beautiful story. The metaphor first emerged in planning sessions throughout late 1940 and early 1941. Hitler gathered his generals in the Reich Chancellery, maps of the Soviet Union spread across conference tables. The sheer scale of the territory they proposed to conquer should have given pause, distances that dwarfed the campaigns in Poland and France. But Hitler's confidence was contagious, built on a foundation of recent triumphs. Poland conquered in weeks. France subdued in 6 weeks. The supposedly invincible French army shattered by German panzers. The British pushed off the continent. Every prediction of quick victory had proven correct. Why would the Soviet Union be different? The whole edifice will come crumbling down, Hitler assured his officers, using architectural imagery to describe a nation of 170 million people. We need only kick in the door. The generals around the table had varying reactions. Some nodded enthusiastically. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keidel, who rarely contradicted Hitler, agreed immediately. Others maintained careful neutral expressions, recognizing the danger of voicing doubt during moments of the Führer's certainty. But one man in particular understood the fatal flaw in Hitler's metaphor. General Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff, had studied Napoleon's 1812 campaign extensively. He knew what happened when European armies pushed deep into Russia. He understood logistics, supply lines, the tyranny of distance. Halder said nothing, not then. The metaphor took root in German strategic thinking, replacing analysis with imagery. Soviet society was rotten because it was communist. Communist societies were inherently weak because they suppressed individual initiative. Therefore, one decisive blow, one kick, would cause systemic collapse. The reasoning was ideological, not empirical. Hitler's worldview demanded that communism be fragile. His entire political philosophy was built on the premise that Marxist systems were doomed to fail. If communism could be strong, resilient, capable of withstanding German assault, then Hitler's entire understanding of history was wrong. He could not allow that possibility. Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch, commander-in-chief of the German army, raised practical concerns. The distances are substantial, he noted carefully. Moscow lies over 1,000 kilometers from our starting positions. Our supply lines. Hitler cut him off. The Red Army will collapse before supply lines become relevant. We saw their incompetence in Finland. He was referring to the Winter War of 1939–1940, when Finland, a nation of fewer than 4 million people, had inflicted humiliating casualties on Soviet forces. If tiny Finland could embarrass the Red Army, surely the Wehrmacht could destroy it. The logic seemed sound. The conclusion was inevitable. The metaphor became strategy. On December 18, 1940, Hitler signed Directive No. 21, officially authorizing Operation Barbarossa, named for the medieval Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, a leader of the Third Crusade. The directive called for the German armed forces to crush Soviet Russia in a quick campaign. A quick campaign. The phrase appeared throughout German planning documents. Quick victory was not merely desired, it was required. Germany's economy, already strained by years of rearmament and war, could not sustain a prolonged two-front conflict. Oil reserves were limited. Steel production was stretched. Food supplies depended on swift conquest of Ukraine's agricultural regions, but these material constraints never penetrated Hitler's certainty. The campaign would be quick because he declared it would be quick. The door would collapse because he said it was rotten. In early 1941, as 3 million German soldiers massed along the Soviet border, quartermaster reports began circulating among senior staff. One document stood out, a supply assessment showing that winter clothing had not been requisitioned for the invasion force. The reason was simple. Hitler expected Moscow to fall before winter. Therefore, winter clothing was unnecessary. General Eduard Wagner, Quartermaster General, briefly considered raising this issue directly with Hitler. The omission seemed potentially catastrophic if the campaign lasted longer than predicted, but Wagner had seen what happened to officers who delivered unwelcome news. Pessimism was treated as defeatism. Caution was viewed as cowardice. Wagner approved the supply manifest without winter clothing. On June 21, 1941, the night before invasion, German soldiers gathered at assembly points along a 1,800-mile front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. They wore summer-weight uniforms. They carried ammunition sufficient for 6 to 8 weeks of combat. Their supply trains were configured for campaign lasting until autumn at the latest. No one had planned for winter because their leader had declared winter irrelevant. At 3:00 a.m. on June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa began. 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory, supported by 600,000 motorized vehicles, 750,000 horses, 3,600 tanks, and 2,700 aircraft. It was the largest invasion force in human history, and every single soldier believed they would be home before snow fell. The initial assault exceeded even Hitler's optimistic predictions. German panzers smashed through Soviet border defenses, encircling entire armies before they could retreat. The Luftwaffe destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft, many still on the ground, in the first hours of combat. By the end of the first day, German forces had advanced over 50 miles into Soviet territory. By the end of the first week, entire Soviet armies had been surrounded and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers became prisoners. The Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. In Berlin, Hitler received reports with growing satisfaction. His metaphor was proving accurate. The Red Army was crumbling exactly as he had predicted. The rotten structure was collapsing. Hitler told his generals during a briefing on June 29th. I knew the Bolshevik system was weak. One strong blow and it falls apart. But scattered among the triumphant reports were details that should have triggered alarm. Soviet prisoners were not demoralized, defeated soldiers. They were stunned by the scale of German assault, but far from broken. Soviet units that had been bypassed did not surrender. They fought from encirclement, disrupting German supply lines. And behind the collapsing front lines, Soviet factories were beginning a transformation that German intelligence had not anticipated. Entire industrial complexes in Western Russia were being dismantled, loaded onto trains, and shipped east beyond German reach. General Halder noted these developments in his diary, but hesitated to emphasize them in briefings. The prevailing narrative was one of inevitable triumph. Contradictory information was noted, but not featured. By mid-July, German forces had advanced over 400 miles into Soviet territory. Army Group North approached Leningrad. Army Group Center closed on Smolensk, less than 250 miles from Moscow. Army Group South swept through Ukraine toward the Donets Basin and Caucasus oil fields. The speed of advance created its own problems. Supply lines stretched thin. Fuel trucks traveled hundreds of miles to deliver gasoline to forward units. Spare parts became scarce. Vehicles broke down faster than they could be repaired. But these logistical strains were temporary, Hitler assured his staff. Once Moscow fell, Soviet resistance would collapse completely. Then supply lines could be reorganized at leisure. The assumption pervaded every level of German planning. Total victory was weeks away. On July 3, 1941, just 11 days after the invasion began, Halder wrote in his diary, "It is probably no overstatement to say that the Russian campaign has been won in the space of 2 weeks. Won in 2 weeks. This was not propaganda for public consumption. This was the chief of the General Staff's private assessment. The delusion had infected even the most analytically minded military professionals. But 1,000 miles east, a different reality was taking shape. Stalin had recovered from the initial shock of invasion. Soviet commanders were organizing new defensive lines. Fresh divisions were being brought up from reserves in Siberia and Central Asia. And Soviet industrial capacity, relocated beyond German reach, was beginning to produce tanks, aircraft, and artillery at rates German intelligence had not believed possible. General Hermann Harth, commanding the 3rd Panzer Group, submitted a report in late July noting that Soviet resistance was not weakening as expected. "For every division we destroy," Harth wrote, 2 more appear to take its place. The report reached Halder's desk. Halder filed it without bringing it to Hitler's attention. The momentum of certainty was too strong. To question the narrative of inevitable victory was to question Hitler himself. By August 1941, German forces had suffered over 400,000 casualties. Panzer divisions that began the campaign with 200 tanks each now fielded fewer than 100. Infantry divisions were at 80% strength. The rate of advance had slowed as Soviet resistance stiffened, yet Hitler's confidence never wavered. "We are fighting subhumans," he declared in a meeting with military staff. "They cannot match German will and German skill. The fact that they continue fighting only proves they don't understand they have already lost." The door was kicked, but somehow, impossibly, it had not collapsed. On September 6, 1941, Hitler issued a new directive. Army Group Center would not immediately advance on Moscow. Instead, forces would be diverted to help secure Leningrad in the north and Ukraine in the south. The capture of Moscow could wait until these resource-rich regions were secured. The decision stunned German generals who understood that their window for taking Moscow was rapidly closing. General Heinz Guderian, Germany's most successful panzer commander, protested directly. "If we do not take Moscow before winter, we will face a prolonged campaign for which we are not prepared." Hitler dismissed the concern. "Moscow is not decisive. Resources are decisive. Once we control Ukrainian agriculture and Caucasian oil, the Soviet regime will be unable to sustain resistance." The strategic argument had merit in the abstract, but it ignored the calendar. Autumn rains were approaching. After the rains would come winter, and despite Guderian's warning, no one had prepared for winter operations. General Wagner, the quartermaster general, quietly examined supply inventories in early September. His findings were alarming. Winter clothing sufficient for approximately 10% of German forces in the east. Winterization equipment for vehicles had not been stockpiled in forward areas. Lubricants suitable for sub-zero temperatures were in critically short supply. Wagner requested authorization to begin emergency procurement of winter equipment. His request was denied. The campaign would be concluded before winter. Winter preparations were therefore unnecessary and would signal defeatism to the troops. By October 1941, autumn rains had turned unpaved Russian roads into rivers of mud. German vehicles, designed for European highways, sank to their axles. Horses collapsed pulling artillery through the mire. Supply convoys that should have taken hours took days. Food rations were cut. Ammunition was rationed. Fuel deliveries slowed to a trickle. The advance on Moscow finally resumed in early October under Operation Typhoon, but the Germans were no longer the unstoppable force of June. Divisions were under strength, tanks were worn out, soldiers were exhausted, and the calendar showed mid-October. On October 7th, the first snow fell near Moscow. It melted quickly, adding to the mud. But it was a warning that German commanders could no longer ignore. Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann, serving with the 258th Infantry Division outside Moscow, wrote in a letter home dated October 12th, "The cold is becoming uncomfortable, and we have no winter coats. Officers assure us the campaign will end before serious winter arrives. But the Russian peasants we encounter tell us winter here is nothing like German winter. They laugh when we ask when it truly begins. It has already begun, they say." The letter never reached Germany. Hartmann died of exposure in December, his body found frozen in a trench wearing the same summer weight uniform he had worn in June. By November, temperatures around Moscow dropped below freezing and stayed there. German soldiers began cutting up blankets to wrap around their feet. They stuffed newspapers inside their tunics for insulation. Some stripped clothing from Soviet corpses, and still no winter clothing arrived. The problem was not just procurement, it was logistics. Winter clothing had finally been manufactured in Germany and shipped east, but it sat in warehouses hundreds of miles behind the front lines because the broken German supply system could not transport it forward. Trucks that might have carried clothing were carrying ammunition. Rail cars that might have transported coats were transporting fuel. The Wehrmacht faced a brutal choice: supply soldiers with weapons to continue fighting or supply them with clothing to survive. There was not enough transport capacity for both. Hitler chose weapons. The offensive must continue. Taking Moscow would end the war. Survival gear could arrive after victory. On November 13, 1941, temperatures near Moscow dropped to -20 degrees F. German weapons began malfunctioning. Rifle bolts froze. Machine guns jammed. Tank engines would not start. Soldiers wrapped rags around their hands to prevent skin from freezing to metal. General Guderian sent an urgent message to headquarters. "The condition of the troops is desperate. Frostbite cases now exceed combat casualties. Without immediate winter equipment, divisions will become combat ineffective within days." The message reached Hitler on November 15th. He read it twice, then set it aside. "Guderian lacks willpower," Hitler told aides. "The German soldier's spirit will overcome discomfort. We are so close to Moscow that one final push will end Soviet resistance." The final push began on November 27th. German forces reached the outer suburbs of Moscow. Some patrols came within sight of the Kremlin's spires. They had advanced over 1,000 miles from their starting positions. Destroyed or captured over 3 million Soviet soldiers, conquered territory larger than Western Europe. But they had not taken Moscow, and winter had arrived in full force. On December 5th, temperatures dropped to -40 degrees F. That same day, Soviet forces launched a massive counteroffensive. Fresh Siberian divisions, fully equipped with winter clothing, skis, and weapons designed for cold weather, smashed into exhausted German lines. The Wehrmacht, the army that had conquered Europe, began to retreat. General Günther Blumentritt, serving on the Moscow front, later wrote, "That December, we finally understood what we had done. We had invaded Russia wearing summer uniforms because our Führer said we would win quickly. We had believed one kick would collapse the door. We did not believe in winter because our leader did not believe in winter. And now we were dying because certainty had replaced preparation. Field Marshal Fedor von Bach, commander of Army Group Center, stood in his headquarters outside Moscow on December 8, 1941, reading casualty reports by candlelight. The numbers told a story that ideology could not explain away. Since June 22, 734,000 German casualties, over 23% of the invasion force. And that was before winter truly took hold. Current frostbite cases, over 100,000. More men lost to cold than to combat in the past 2 weeks. Operational tanks in Army Group Center, fewer than 500, down from over 2,000 in June. Temperature, minus 38 degrees F and falling. Bach set down the reports and walked to the frosted window. Outside, soldiers were burning furniture to stay warm. They had already burned every wooden structure for miles. Soon they would have nothing left to burn. How did we reach this point? Bach asked his chief of staff. The answer went unspoken. They had reached this point because their Führer had said winter did not matter, and they had believed him. Back in Berlin, Hitler was receiving similar reports from all 3 army groups. The numbers were undeniable. The Eastern Army was at the end of its resources in both personnel and material. But Hitler's response was not to acknowledge failure. It was to demand more certainty, more willpower, more faith in ultimate victory. On December 16th, Hitler issued a directive: no retreat. German forces would hold their current positions regardless of Soviet counterattacks. Any officer who ordered withdrawal would be court-martialed. The order was militarily insane. German forces extended across impossible distances, supplied by broken logistics, defended by frostbitten soldiers. Tactical withdrawal to defensible winter positions was elementary military doctrine. But Hitler was not making a military decision. He was making an ideological one. To retreat was to admit the campaign had failed. To admit failure was to acknowledge that his certainty had been wrong. His entire worldview could not accommodate that possibility. General Guderian, witnessing his exhausted divisions being ordered to hold indefensible positions, made a decision that would end his command. He ordered a tactical withdrawal to save his troops. Hitler relieved him of command on December 26. Also dismissed: Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, Commander-in-Chief of the Army; General Hoepner, Commander of 4th Panzer Group; General Strauss, Commander of 9th Army. Over 30 senior officers were relieved of command during December 1941 and January 1942 for the crime of recognizing reality. Hitler appointed himself Commander-in-Chief of the Army. Now there would be no one to question his judgment, no one to present contradictory evidence, no one to suggest that certainty was not a substitute for preparation. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles to the east, Soviet factories were producing tanks at rates that made German intelligence reports seem like jokes. In 1941, Soviet industry produced over 6,000 tanks. In 1942, that number would exceed 24,000. German tank production in 1941, approximately 3,800. The mathematics were becoming undeniable. But Hitler had long since stopped listening to mathematics. Private Friedrich Weber, serving with the 34th Infantry Division, wrote in his diary on December 20th, "We are eating horse meat and burning horse dung for warmth. My hands are black with frostbite. I cannot feel my feet. Yesterday, 3 men in my company froze to death in their sleep. The officers tell us the Führer has ordered us to hold this position. We will receive winter clothing soon. Reinforcements are coming. The Soviets are at the breaking point. But the Soviets have winter coats. We do not. The Soviets have fresh divisions. We have skeletal companies. The Soviets are advancing. We are freezing. I think perhaps someone has lied to us about this war. I think perhaps the door was not rotten. I think perhaps we should have brought winter coats." Weber did not survive to see January. The German offensive had stalled by late December 1941. Hitler's quick campaign had become a grinding war of attrition, exactly the scenario German planners had feared most. But the true cost was only beginning to become clear. Casualties from Operation Barbarossa's first 6 months, over 830,000 German soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. This represented roughly 25% of the invasion force. Frostbite casualties, over 228,000 cases by February 1942, many required amputation. The Wehrmacht was creating an entire generation of maimed soldiers because their supreme commander had not believed in winter. Vehicle losses, over 65% of German trucks on the Eastern Front were inoperable by January 1942. Most had never been winterized. Horses, over 180,000 died from cold, overwork, and lack of fodder by March 1942. German logistics depended on horse transport far more than propaganda suggested. But perhaps most devastating was the psychological cost. The Wehrmacht, the army that had seemed invincible, had been stopped by an enemy Hitler had declared incapable of serious resistance. And it had been stopped not primarily by Soviet military skill, though that played a role, but by German failure to prepare for predictable conditions. Russia has winter. This was not a secret. Napoleon had learned it in 1812. Yet Hitler's certainty had been so absolute that 3 million men invaded Russia wearing summer uniforms. General Halder, still serving as chief of staff despite his growing disillusionment, wrote in his diary on January 2, 1942, "The Eastern Campaign has revealed a fundamental flaw in our leadership. The Führer believes that willpower can overcome material realities. He declared the Soviet system rotten, so he believed it was rotten. He said the campaign would end before winter, so he believed winter was irrelevant. But tanks do not run on willpower. Soldiers do not survive -40 degrees temperatures through ideology. And the Soviet Union has proven far less rotten than the Führer's certainty. I fear we have begun something we cannot finish, and I fear that saying this aloud would mean my immediate dismissal. Halder would be proven correct on both counts. The war would continue for 3 more years of escalating catastrophe, and Halder would be dismissed in September 1942 for insufficient faith in Hitler's judgment. Back in Germany, the civilian population was learning of the winter crisis through a remarkable admission of failure. On December 20, 1941, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels published an appeal in the magazine Reich calling for heavy sacrifices from the German people. The article announced a new campaign. Every German household should donate winter clothing to be sent to soldiers in the East. Any kind of headgear protection, furs in all senses of the word. Everything of wool is needed urgently. It was an astonishing reversal. For months, propaganda had proclaimed inevitable swift victory. Now the government was begging civilians to donate coats and blankets because the state had failed to provide them. The collection campaign ran from December 27 to January 4, 1942. Germans donated over 76 million items of winter clothing, but most of it never reached the soldiers who needed it. The same broken logistics that had failed to deliver military winter clothing also prevented civilian donations from reaching the front. Warehouses in Warsaw and Minsk overflowed with donated coats, while soldiers 500 miles east froze to death. Frau Christina Hartmann of Munich donated her late husband's wool coat to the collection drive in early January. She imagined it warming some young soldier near Moscow. The coat sat in a warehouse in Poland until the Red Army captured the depot in 1944. It was still there, never worn, when Soviet soldiers liberated the facility. Her son, Klaus, the same Klaus Hartmann who had written about the cold in October, had frozen to death in December wearing a summer uniform. The German offensive resumed in summer 1942 under Operation Blue. But the momentum was gone. Hitler still spoke of inevitable victory, but his generals now knew they were fighting a war they could not win. The mathematics had become impossible to ignore. Soviet industrial production exceeded German estimates by orders of magnitude. American Lend-Lease aid was pouring into the Soviet Union. The Red Army was growing stronger while the Wehrmacht was bleeding out. In August 1942, German forces reached Stalingrad. What should have been a brief battle for a strategic city became a 5-month meat grinder that destroyed Germany's most battle-hardened army. On February 2, 1943, the German Sixth Army, over 90,000 survivors of a force that had numbered 300,000, surrendered at Stalingrad. It was Germany's first major surrender of the war. Hitler had promised he would never abandon Stalingrad. He had declared its capture essential. He had ordered no retreat. His certainty had cost 300,000 German soldiers, and the door still had not collapsed. In July 1943, Hitler ordered one more offensive, Operation Citadel, an attempt to destroy Soviet forces near Kursk. It was the largest tank battle in history. The Germans were defeated. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht never launched another major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. For the next 2 years, German forces would retreat steadily westward, fighting desperate defensive battles, losing hundreds of thousands more men. In June 1944, Soviet forces launched Operation Bagration, destroying German Army Group Center, the same force that had come within sight of the Kremlin in 1941. Over 300,000 more German casualties. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet artillery shells exploded above his bunker in Berlin, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. The man who had declared that kicking in the door would collapse the Soviet Union was dead. Soviet soldiers were raising their flag over the Reichstag. Total German military deaths on the Eastern Front, approximately 4 million soldiers. Total Soviet military and civilian deaths, over 27 million. The door Hitler had kicked in 1941 had not been rotten. It had been reinforced by suffering, hardened by determination, and defended by people who refused to collapse on command. What Adolf Hitler said in those crucial months before and after Operation Barbarossa revealed not German strength, but the depths of his delusion. His June declaration, that kicking in the door would collapse the Soviet Union, created a strategic psychology that made rational planning impossible. By reducing a nation of 170 million people to a metaphor, he convinced himself and his generals that ideology could overcome logistics, that certainty could replace preparation, that winter itself would bend to his will. The invasion Hitler declared would succeed before winter cost over 4 million German lives. The quick campaign that required no winter clothing became a 4-year war of annihilation. The rotten structure he promised would collapse stood firm while his own Reich crumbled. In the end, Hitler's greatest miscalculation was believing that saying something would happen could make it so. His metaphor about kicking indoors was not military analysis. It was wishful thinking wrapped in certainty. And it cost millions of lives, destroyed a nation, and proved that no amount of ideological conviction can overcome reality when that reality includes Russian winter and an enemy who refuses to behave as your metaphors demand. The door remained standing. The army sent to kick it froze to death instead. And history recorded that certainty divorced from preparation is not strength, it is suicide at scale.